welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol Banega Swasth India. It is our pleasure to present today Opening Kailasanatha, the temple in Kanchipuram revealed in time and space. Padma Kaimal in conversation with Anirudh Kanisetti. The historic Kailasanath temple is among the oldest surviving monuments in Kanchipuram, Tamil Nadu. Adorned by exquisite figures and symbols of divinity and the everyday alike, the temple is a complex visual feast and a vivid frame past centuries to the ancient Indic south. Writer and Professor Padma Kaimal deciphers the intricate Kailasanath temple and illuminates its history and makers, both warriors in earthly engagement and ascetics in spiritual quest. In her book, Opening Kailasanatha, the temple in Kanchipuram revealed in time and space. In conversation with Anirudh Kanisetti, historian and author of Lords of the Deccan, Southern India from the Chalukyas to the Cholas, Kaimal discusses the aesthetic key to life, longing, and civilization in the ancient South. Padma Kaimal. Padma Kaimal is the Batsa Family Chair in Art History at Colgate University in New York. Her research questions common assumptions about art from the Tamil region. Did kings build the only architecture that matters? Did men? Are the boundaries of India's modern states meaningful for understanding beautiful temples of the past? How do narrative sculptures tell their stories? Are fierce goddesses demonic? Are museums the problem, the solution, or both to contentions over cultural property? Kaimal is the author of Opening Kailasanatha, the temple in Kanchipuram revealed in time and space, and Scattered Goddesses, Travels with the Yogis. Anirudh Kanisetti is a history researcher and writer. He is the author of Lords of the Deccan, Southern India from the Chalukyas to the Cholas, presenting a new history of early medieval India. His work has been featured in The Hindu, The New Indian Express, Live Mint, and The Print, among others. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comment section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and tag @JaipurLitFest. Ladies and gentlemen, Opening Kailasanath, the temple in Kanchipuram revealed in time and space. Padma Kaimal in conversation with Anirudh Kanisetti.
Welcome all of you to this session of the Jaipur Literature Festival, and welcome, of course, Professor Kaimal. It's such an absolute pleasure to be talking to you today. As I was studying Professor Kaimal just before the session started, I've been a tremendous fan of her work for years. It really began with this fascinating paper that she had written about color and sculpture in South Asia, where she made this very thought-provoking case about the way that we see medieval sculptures is that they were these kind of colorless objects, very similar to neoclassical sculptures from Greece and Rome. And she made this very perceptive argument that this preconception we have of them is really based on nothing more than this stereotype that we inherited rather than hard evidence. And it has been so impressive to really see this out of the box thinking. I think characterizes a lot of Professor Kaimal's work, really expanded into this magnificent full-length book that we're going to be discussing today, Opening Kailasanatha, the temple in Kanchipuram revealed in time and space. I can tell you right at the outset that if you're interested at all in Indian temple architecture, or even more generally in the Indian temple as an architectural concept. And if you really want to understand how their original makers would have made these buildings more than 1,000 years ago, and how their meanings have changed over time, then there is really no better book that you can read, because from the iconography to the architecture of the temple, and through a very deep and critical art historical reading that's also coupled with actually visiting the temple and seeing how it transforms through the year with light and darkness, and really reading it in conjunction with literature and all these other fascinating contemporary sources, I really believe that this book has broken new ground in in terms of how we understand medieval temples and the minds of the people who made them. So with all that out of the way, welcome once again, Professor Kaimal. It's a real pleasure to be hosting you and to be in conversation with you. So let me get started by asking you first, why the Kailasanathar temple at Kanchipuram? What was it about this particular shrine that drove you to undertake such an in-depth study of it?
That's a wonderful question, Anirudh, and thank you for this lovely introduction. Why the Kailasanathar? Well, it actually was a shock to me the first time that I went there, because I was thinking it would just be a quick visit. I'd see what I needed to see. I had a few select sculptures I was curious about because I was thinking about portraiture, and somebody had argued that there were some portraits at that monument. So, okay, we'll go there. And I arrived, and it just pulled me in with so much richness. There were so many beautiful sculptures on so many surfaces, and you couldn't take it all in an hour. I stayed there for hours, and the people I'd come with got really bored and sort of started coming and going, and I couldn't stop looking, and I really couldn't wrap my head around it. And I thought, I'm just going to have to keep returning to this amazing space to try to comprehend what's going on in here. And then the other motivation is that a dear friend of mine, Dennis Hudson, who's a professor at Smith College in South Asian religion, became really interested in the temple across town, the Vaikuntha Perumal, also in Kanchipuram. And he read it in this very subtle, complicated way. And as I listened to him giving a paper on it, I realized, well, we have to do the same thing for the Kailasanathar, because the two buildings are really in a kind of interesting conversation with each other. They're built about 50 years apart, and it's very clear that the Vaikuntha Perumal is talking to the Kailasanathar, but we didn't know what the Kailasanathar might be saying to the Vaikuntha Perumal. So I thought, well, okay, let's figure this out. And I knew at the time when I started this that this was going to be a long project. And I thought, well, but I can't resist.
What I find most fascinating about the book is that it does such a fantastic job of locating the Kailasanathar in time. I feel like a lot of the resources that are available online, or most accessible to the general public, tend to say that, okay, this was built by Narasimhavarman II. He had these titles, his son added to it, his queens built it, but they don't necessarily connect it to other contemporary buildings. They don't connect it to evolving iconographies in the way that your book does. And the point that I made about it being in conversation with the Vaikuntha Perumal, I think, also shows us that Kanchi at the time was a place of considerable political, religious, and cultural tumult. And it is, of course, a city that is dominated by the Pallava dynasty. And I'm very curious as to, as you studied both the Vaikuntha Perumal, especially, of course, the Kailasanathar, what really shone out to you about the Pallavas? Did you get to know them as subjects, I suppose, seeing the products of their mind and their art over the years that you spent studying this temple?
That's a wonderful question. And I have to tell you that my work was enormously supported and inspired by the work of three colleagues of mine in France. And they have written, a woman named Valérie Gillet wrote a very close iconographic study of Pallava sculpture. And she set each of the sculptures at the Kailasanathar in juxtaposition with similar sculptures at other Pallava temples. So that was a really helpful tool. And then the scholar Emmanuel Francis, who likes to be called Manu, had written an amazing dissertation on Pallava sculpture and inscriptions. And he came up with this wonderful idea about these kind of twinned ideologies of Pallava kings, wanting to be both warriors on the battlefield and, very engaged in this physical world and mighty lovers of women, but also these ascetics who had this incredible power of restraint and magic. So his idea helped, that allowed me to start making much more sense of what I was seeing in material form. And then Charlotte Schmidt, the third in that threesome of amazing colleagues who do a lot of collaboration together, has also written some wonderful work on the role of Skanda in the iconography there. And I just went to the monument with these three people and often a bunch of other people. We went in these lovely seminars that they ran called The Archaeology of Bhakti, coming out of the Pondicherry.
Yes.
And we would just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. So through those conversations and this engagement with their work and gazing at the monument, I really did start to feel like I was crossing time and space, and I was starting to get inside these minds that were completely different from mine. You know, I couldn't have sketched these out even from reading all the literature that's available. There were things that the monument started to tell me that I had never expected to learn. And that was very exciting, that these were really brilliant people. I'm not sure I would have wanted to, be best friends with any of them. I think they were very powerful and kind of scary, but that they had these incredibly subtle categories and ways of understanding power and gender and the balance between being connected to this life and letting go of this life. How do you live so fully in it, but also be able at one point to take initiation into tantric ideology that is helping you to leave this world, but also leave rebirth, completely transcend any connections, even in the future, with this incredibly vibrant life that they were clearly living.
It's beautiful to think about. I mean, I feel like we have a tendency today, at least speaking from the perspective of a member of the general public who is extremely interested in history, there's a tendency almost to project very modern ideas of religion and very modern perceptions of gender and so on onto these figures who lived in an utterly and totally different world. And I mean, when you made the point in the book about the Pallavas perceiving themselves as royal yogis, that really just stuck with me because the concept of yogi itself has changed so much over the last century or so, right? It has become a concept that's very much suited to a yoga studio, something that's very much about a very new age kind of understanding of spirituality. But the way the Pallavas thought about it, participating in these traditions like Shaiva Siddhanta, which were still emerging and still evolving at the time, and the fact that they are taking, as you said, Professor, they're taking these very, very complex and subtle and, to us at least, somewhat alien and poorly understood concepts.
Yeah.
And that they are expressing it through art and architecture, through such a tremendously expensive building. I mean, it staggers me to think of the amount of effort that they put into designing and constructing something like this. And the fact that it's all driven by such a extraordinarily complex and sophisticated understanding of this world and their place in it. And I mean, I mean, I don't know how else to put except to say that it just blew my mind. To catch glimpses of these totally different people and this remnant of their world, and to see how differently it is understood today. You have some magnificent photos in the book of these sculptures. Many of them are actually covered in this thick layer of plaster. And it seems almost to me that plaster both conceals the sculpture itself in its actual physical form, but also in the way that it may have been seen and received by its original audience, right? So the plaster is almost a metaphor for the ignorance and perhaps the changing of minds and ideas over these many centuries that obscures our understanding of what these sculptures actually mean. Sorry, I've gone to a bit
That's
of a
quite
poetic tangent.
beautiful. I love that, the plaster as a metaphor. I really struggled with the plaster. I have an intense love-hate relationship with the plaster. And I actually had another chapter that was in this book, and I had to take it out just because the book was very long, but also because it kind of told a different story. I have, and this has now just come out in Artibus Asiae as it's called Loved and Unloved. And it's a history of the monument from the 8th century until the year 2000. So following all of the changes that we can infer and the changes that we have records from the Archaeological Survey of India. And one of the stories that I covered there is the plaster, because it's on again, off again, on again, off again. And what we can tell from the nature of the sandstone itself is that it always was intended to be covered with a thin skim of plaster. It's not a good quality stone, and when it's exposed to the air, it deteriorates. So from the start, there was always a thin layer of plaster, and to return to your first point, Anirudh, there was paint on that original layer of plaster, and the paint was bright green and blue and orange and yellow and red, with black, elegant black eyeliner and very, very lovely paint. And so as people approached it initially with an archaeological frame of mind in the 19th century and the early 20th century, really, they just started removing all of it because they wanted to see the beautiful sculpture underneath. And then they lost the layer, the original layer of the plaster. And then they started to realize what they were doing. And so, yeah, back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, I was in the introduction itself. I think you had this beautiful line where you talked about all the colors that the temple would have been decorated with. And I was just thinking, I mean, it is so profusely adorned with sculpture already. To kind of imagine it as it would have been, fully painted, it must have been a real sight to behold. A true, like a really overwhelming sensory experience almost. But coming back to the main thread that I kind of got distracted from with the whole plaster analogy, there's this idea of the Pallava king as a royal yogi. I think is very integral to the iconography of the building. So if you could tell us a little more, Professor, about like how do the sculptures kind of use gods almost as a kind of a political iconographic tool to express these complex ideas of Pallava kingship. How exactly does it manage to do that? And also, how did it emerge to you that that was really what the temple was trying to get at?
Oh, wonderful. Another wonderful question, Aniruddha. So, what I noticed first about the sculpture and the inscriptions around the sculpture was a complementarity. So the sculptures are primarily representing Shiva in various forms, and the inscriptions compared the king to all kinds of deities, but never to Shiva. So there was a complementarity going on there. And then I read the work of Daoud Ali on Prashasti, where he does this incredible intertextual survey of all different kinds of writings from medieval India and comes up with a consistent belief that kings understood themselves to be continuing the acts that the gods had performed in the Puranic times. So there was a sense of direct connection and similar action, but over an extremely long period of time. So that that helped me an awful lot to see what the complementary relationship between sculpture and in historical inscription could be. That the sculptures are telling us about that Puranic time and the acts of Shiva and other gods in those ancient times. And then this inscription running underneath them around the central tower is telling us the history of the Pallava kings. They're in a genealogical form. So starting with their origins from gods, and then in sages, and then the first Pallava is born, and then there are several Pallavas described, and then we come to the Narasimhavarman II himself, the patron of this central building. And then I realized that there's a kind of parallel storytelling between the sculptures above and the text down below, showing us that the kings are in fact doing the same things that the gods used to do. And that gives us one of our insights into how they think about kingship, that it's like the gods, it isn't replacing the gods. It's one of the stereotypes that it's really easy to run up against in any culture that has a connection with the ancient Romans is the idea that a king who styles themselves as a deity is some kind of horrible tyrant taking too much power unto themselves. We think of Caligula, we think of other Roman emperors kind of losing control and thinking that they're gods. But my understanding is that with probably most medieval Indian kings, the connection to the divine was much more a sense of a very heavy responsibility that they carried on their shoulders. They had to perpetuate the important things the gods could do in a time when the gods were no longer right there all the time. So kingship is this responsibility to protect people, to protect a kingdom, to protect the earth, to save water, to encourage fecundity in plants and animals, to really keep the whole cosmos going the way the gods had done it.
That's actually incredibly moving and profound, and once again, I would say almost alien, right? Because it seems so different from the way that we think about kingship today, or even political leadership, in the sense that it is so profoundly connected to religion and to spirituality and the way that these people saw the world, and this tradition that they had inherited that was already many centuries old. This rich tradition of religion and speculative thought. That Pallava princes would have been educated in from the time that they were children. And like you said a little earlier, Professor, I mean, these would have been incredibly fascinating and complex and layered people, but I would not want to be best friends with them, given the kind of responsibility that they believe they carried on their shoulders. In addition to the fact that, of course, they're extremely powerful and rich, and all these kind of seem to defy our modern categories of what the rich and powerful are like. There's a sense of connection, but also of like very profound disconnection. And I'm so grateful that your book actually helps us visualize these medieval rulers in such a nuanced, really humanizing way. But you mentioned a little earlier this idea of like Shiva, the king never comparing himself to Shiva. Whereas he does compare himself to a whole bunch of other deities. And I think another thing that I found fascinating was, as you said, as you say in your book, this almost a subordination of other deities into Shiva, this kind of incorporation of their forms and their iconography into the body of Shiva. And I'm particularly curious about like how this incorporation of other gods, such as, for example, Buddha, into Shiva, kind of what it reveals to us about the religious cosmopolitanism of the city of Kanchi. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
So the religious cosmopolitan of the city. We have so much evidence of there being strong, continuous Buddhist practice in Kanchi and strong, continuous Jaina practice as well. There are archaeological footprints of stupas. There's all kinds of traces that indicate that Buddhism is still flourishing while the Kailasanatha is being built, and Jainism as well. And I tended to carry with me from school this sense that, Buddhism just dies, except for in a couple of corners, like in the Pala dynasty in Bengal, and some fragments here or there, but it's gone in maybe 6th, 7th century. And instead, I think it just continued to flourish and be meaningful and powerful, and often merged with people's ideas around the gods we now call Hindu. But I think that sense of Buddhism and Hinduism being extremely different sorts of things, I think that's a pretty late artifact, maybe even like 19th century. And that there is, when we're thinking of the Pallavas, there's a sense that there are all kinds of deities, and they are all powerful in their own ways, but you also tend to want to have a favorite. You have an Ishta Devata, and it's fine to have a favorite, but you're often thinking about how that favorite of yours exists in relationship to the other deities. I think there's also probably a much more materialist way in which the iconography of the Kailasanatha got thought through, and that was that Shiva was a relatively new god to be encouraging people to choose as their Ishtadevata. And so you needed to make the monument translatable to people who had other favorite deities, other spiritual connections. So to people who practice Buddhism, there are images of the Shiva looking just like the Buddha sitting underneath the peepal tree and sermonizing, surrounded by wild creatures and sages. Other images of him wandering as a mendicant in the forest, living on what people would choose to give him.
Yeah.
So there are these sort of multivalent images that we now read as Hindu iconography in these new these new categories that matter to us, but that I think were very, very legible to people who were actively practicing connections to other deities in the early 8th century.
So this actually brings up the question of why exactly was it that the Pallavas chose Shiva? What was it about Shiva, or the followers of Shiva, and the kind of ritual apparatus, perhaps, or the esoteric knowledge that they were able to offer to the Pallavas that kind of marked them out for this kind of treatment? Why was so much effort put into making a temple to Shiva? Why was so much effort put into translating him into all these other sects? Why Shiva?
That is such an interesting question. I'm not sure. I haven't thought about that as much as I should have. I think, the Pallavas had been in Kanchi at that point for 4 centuries or so. So they weren't newcomers. I don't know. Oops, sorry. I have one of these motion sensitive lights. I hope I've still got enough light on me.
No, I can still see you. Yeah, it should
okay,
be
good. Why did they like Shiva so much? They shift, actually. And Charlotte Schmidt is the one who has done spectacular research on this. She finds that actually the predecessors, maybe the grandfather, great-grandfather of Narasimhavarman II, is a strong Vaishnava. And he is the one, he is connected with a lot of the early work at Mamallapuram, the rock-cut monuments, a number of the rock-cut monuments at Mamallapuram. And they focus on Vishnu, and there are dedications, there are inscriptions that are focused to Vishnu as well. Other deities are placed in connection with Vishnu. And then Narasimhavarman II comes in and builds Shaiva monuments on top of these Vaishnava sacred spots and appropriates them, sometimes in a very aggressive way. And a number of these monuments actually carry with them an imprecatory inscription, that is, a curse on people who would worship Vishnu, people who would worship anyone but Shiva. And there are several of these at Mamallapuram. So we do, your question is allowing me to kind of put things together now in a different way, and to realize why Shiva is probably strongly connected with this king, Rajasimha, or Narasimhavarman II. And I wonder now if it wasn't to do with his taking initiation into Shaiva Siddhanta. I wonder if he had a personal connection with a teacher who brought him to treasure Shiva and to see some sort of a competitive relationship with his own family's past Ishtadevata. And certainly we see these again and again, we see these images in which there are strong connections between Shiva's family and the king's family. These Soma Skanda images, Shiva with Uma and Skanda, Sa, Uma, Skanda.
Okay, this once again brings up a whole bunch of interesting questions, because I think this would have been Narasimhavarman's great grandfather, Mahendra Varman I, I think, did write a play, the Mattavilasa Prahasana, which seems to already have some kind of Shaiva leanings. And it is interesting to see how there seems to be this back and forth, and this almost this every generation of the Pallava kings living in this highly cosmopolitan environment seems always to be struggling to define themselves in relation to their ancestors and to the gods who came before them, and they try and carve out this identity for themselves. And Shaiva Siddhanta was again that's something that I found so interesting in the book. Like, there was this first passing mention, I think in the second chapter, or the third chapter, sorry, where he mentioned that Shiva is depicted and there's a torch behind him, and that might be a sign of the flame that Shaiva Siddhanta teachers used to burn the fingers of initiates. And I was like, that is so interesting. I didn't know that was something that Shaiva Siddhantins did. But can you tell us a little more about like the monument as a symbol of Shaiva Siddhanta? Because what it seems to suggest to us is that Shaiva Siddhanta in the 8th century was very different from what Shaiva Siddhanta would kind of emerge as by the 11th and 12th centuries. So what can you tell us about Shaivism itself being in flux within the broader context of all this other religious and political churn that's happening?
Ah, yes. So here I learned so much from Alexis Sanderson, the Sanskritist at Oxford, who does amazing work. And he in fact focuses on the inscription around the central tower at the Kailasanatha as one of the earliest references to Tantra that exist, earliest physical traces of Tantra that have persisted, because it says, and just as you round the northwest corner of the building, it says that this king, Rajasimha, took initiation as a Shaiva Siddhanta, into Shaiva Siddhanta. And according to Sanderson, I think this is the earliest physical trace of the words Shaiva Siddhanta. And at that point, it is very strongly a tantric practice. And in his understanding of Tantra and his understanding of Tantra across South and Southeast Asia. So it is very, very different from what we see it becoming in the second millennium, where it's really associated with these public forms of worship, these big temples in cities, and rather conservative physical practices that are very abstracted and intellectual. He says it starts out as a very transgressive Shiva, very transgressive tantric practice, and that's the burning of the fingers, the inversions of what we think of as orthodox practice. For me, the strongest trace of those inversions is in the way the monument insists you walk counterclockwise around it. If you are going to read the inscription on any of the shrines that hold lingas, the central tower or ones out in front of it to the east, you must walk counterclockwise. These texts are written in a single line and they wrap around the building. And since Sanskrit reads from left to right, you have to walk counterclockwise to read it. Now, that's not the only way that they could have put the text on the building. They could have put it in multiple lines so you stood still and read it. So this is a very deliberate choice to wrap the monument this way with words. So the building is telling you to go in this transgressive direction. And that transgressive direction is a way of enacting a vow to sever ties with this life and with future lives. So again, we're back in a really interesting world that was very Buddhist, that shares a lot with Buddhism, that people have these choices to be householders, to be engaged with this world of regeneration and physicality, or to become renunciants and to undertake practices that will help them end things, including their own lives. So what the building is teaching us, I think, is complementary to and in addition to what other sources have been able to teach us about Shaiva Siddhanta as a very tantric practice. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, I mean, that is fascinating. I actually have a whole bunch of other follow-up questions, but we are almost out of time. So I'm just going to have one final question for you, and hopefully, if we ever meet, I will ask you to ask them.
I look forward to that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor. But so the last question I had for you is just to kind of like take a couple of steps back to talk more generally about the temple as a kind of multi-generational building. It is very closely associated with Narasimhavarman II, of course, but it's also a building that his son Mahendravarman III made significant contributions to. So how really does it express this this ideal of dynastic continuity that the Pallavas held, while also linking them to Shiva and as kind of almost as earthly manifestations of Shiva's family, the Somaskanda motif, as you said. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So as you know from reading my book, this image of Shiva as a family man, which we call Somaskanda, seated beside the goddess Uma and with their little baby Skanda between them. This is the most frequently replicated imagery at the monument. It exists in dozens and dozens of places in sculpture, and there are traces of it in painting. Probably there were many more painted examples as well. So it is the central theme of the monument, really. And we also have it very clearly in inscriptions, including that passage I was just referring to when I explained the earliest mention of Shaiva Siddhanta. at the northwest corner of the central shrine, right wrapping around that corner is a simile in words in Sanskrit that says, in the same way that the father of the king, the present king, was like Shiva, his son is like Guha, another name for Skanda. So the inscription takes up this imagery of Somaskanda, but only with the men, and compares the divine family to the royal family right there at the beginning of the 8th century, and right underneath a sculpture of a Somaskanda. Just as you come around that corner and you see the second part of the simile, you look up and there's a Somaskanda. So these images do seem to mean to have a royal resonance throughout the monument. And then when Rajasimha's son, Mahendravarman III, builds a linga shrine to the east in a kind of place where you would expect a gopuram, where you would expect an entrance building, he also includes a Somaskanda inside his temple, and he has an inscription that says that it compares himself to Skanda or Guha, and his father Rajasimha to Shiva. So there's a shift that takes place. Kings are not calling themselves Shiva, as I mentioned before. Kings are calling themselves Skanda, and they make their fathers into Shivas. So there's as a young king, as a young prince becomes a king, he becomes a father, then he becomes a Shiva, and his baby becomes a Skanda. And there's this sense of eternally shifting roles, continuities, and successions as Skandas become Shivas, and Shivas give birth to Skandas, who become Shivas, who give birth to Skandas, and on and on and on. The other thing that the son does in his inscription is he weaves in the mother. He brings in Uma and makes himself the child of both gods, and he places his temple in between the temple built by his father and the temple built by Pallava queens, presumably one of whom was his mother. So the buildings become a kind of Somaskanda as well. If you look at them from the south, you see Shiva here, you see Uma here, and you see the father,
Yes,
the mother,
yes.
and the little boy as a smaller building in between them.
Oh, wow. How incredible. And I mean, I think that's really the perfect note to end this session on. Thank you, Professor. This has been, it's been so moving to like have these people, this building brought to life in this utterly profound and humanizing way. And to all of you who attended this session, if you want to read a book that will utterly transform the way you think about Indian temples in general and Kailasanathar in Kanchi in particular, I cannot recommend enough that you get your hands on a copy of Professor Kaimal's book. On that note, thank you so much to all of you for listening to us, and thank you so much, Professor, for joining me. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much.
It's a true pleasure, Anirudh. Thank you so much, and I do look forward to our future conversations.
Me too.
Thank you, Padma and Anirudh, for a fascinating conversation. And thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Sessions are ongoing across all three venues: Front Lawn, Bank of Baroda Mughal Tent, and Darbar Hall. Stay tuned for the next session.